about people pleasing today. So let's get right into it. So I want you to think about the average person. Okay, think about it can be a male or a female, it could be a John Doe or a Jane Doe, but we're going to call this person JD. Okay, so JD is at home sitting on the couch after a long day of work. JD receives a text from a coworker asking if JD will be able to pick up their weekend shift. A few seconds after, JD's neighbor knocks on the door and says, "Hey, JD, I'll be going on vacation next week. Do you mind watching my dog?" And then simultaneously, JD's roommate walks in and says, "Hey, JD, can I borrow your laptop charger?" JD looks at his or her laptop with 5% battery life remaining. Okay, my question to you is, what can we conclude about JD based on these requests? So think about that. Can you put your answers in the chat? And Tracy, you're going to have to tell me what people are saying, if anything, because I cannot see it.
Okay.
You're welcome to unmute yourself as well if you feel comfortable saying it, but otherwise, just put it in the chat because we can monitor it that way. And it's anonymous.
It's a couple typing.
Okay, we'll give it a minute.
JD makes herself available to many people.
Very true.
JD is a person that people feel they can lean on for support when needed.
Absolutely.
There's another one coming in. JD is getting overwhelmed with requests to do things for others. And JD is unable to say no and overextends themselves.
Okay, so all of those are absolutely correct. So typically people will say JD's reliable, JD's helpful, JD, as some of you said, makes him or herself available to others. And that's all great, and those are great qualities. But JD is also a typical people pleaser who has a hard time saying no. One of you had mentioned that as well. You can always count on JD for favors because he or she spends most of his or her time doing things for others. So while this sounds great, this can also lead to a pattern of very unhealthy behaviors, as some of you said. Put a thumbs up in the chat box or share a reaction in your toolbox if you have ever been a JD. Just put your thumbs up because that's easy. And if you've agreed to do something that you were not so thrilled to do. And I want you to ask yourself why you did it. Because people use people pleasing in the same way people use drugs or alcohol or shopping or food to avoid discomfort or approval from others. So at the root of people pleasing is acceptance. So it is an instinct to want to kind of subvert our own needs and emotions for the needs and wants of others. So the act of people pleasing is attached to the worth of what we can do for others. So the people pleasing involves altering your inner world to align with what might make the situation easy or what we call soothe the situation. So, but it is a maladaptive coping strategy that maintains our attachment to others. So it may not always be a problem, but it becomes significant if we start to lose our sense of identity. So putting other people's needs ahead of our own, can cause us to forget who we are and to lose a sense of what our needs are. And it often arises to manage anxiety about other people's reactions or disapproval. So if a person doesn't want to say no often because they're afraid that they'll get a negative reaction from the other person or that person will stop liking them, which is why, again, it kind of makes that sense of self really in a very precarious place. So that constant self-alteration leads to a loss of your own self-identity. And it also relies strictly on others outside of ourselves to determine who we are. And that's not a very good or stable place to be, right? We want to be secure enough in who we are that we're not always basing our opinions about ourselves on what others say and think. And that lack of self-regulation means that you're allowing your emotions to control you. So you don't want to say no to someone because you, I'm hearing some talking in the background. Okay. Because you don't want to lose that sense of who you are, because it also allows for people to manipulate you. Okay, so ask yourself, are you a people pleaser? So if you look up on the screen, you can see all the kind of descriptions of a people pleaser, always putting other needs first, wearing certain masks, so you behave differently in front of some people than you would in front of others, feeling like you're a burden, over apologizing, oversharing is a big one, unable to say no, as we discussed, that chronic need for external validation or approval, constantly scanning the environment for signs of disapproval, refraining from sharing your own opinion because you're afraid of how others may react, overly concerned with pleasing others, having some self-esteem issues, avoiding conflict, boundary issues, neglecting your own needs, or feeling guilty if you do say no. Okay. People pleasers do tend to be good at tuning into what others are feeling or need. So I'm not saying this is all negative. What I'm saying is that it just impacts you as a person, and that feeling of overwhelm or that feeling of losing your sense of self is really important. So that these positive qualities that I discussed come at a price, and that price would be poor self-image, that need to take control or tendency to overachieve. People pleasers often feel constantly drained and stressed. So where does people pleasing come from? So those who become people pleasers may have experienced trauma in their childhood or an upbringing that placed value on perfectionism, achievements, accomplishments, or having placed importance on how a person looks over how they feel. So you have to take a look back at your younger years. Where does this come from? What kind of messages were you given? Many who grew up experiencing trauma become conditioned to read between the lines, to accurately read, for example, their parents' emotions, moods, or environmental cues, which then guide their behaviors to please. So if you live in an environment that tends to be abusive, that as a child, you're always trying to keep, quote, keep the peace. So you're going to read other people all the time, and then you're going to see if they start to get agitated, then you want to back off and kind of become invisible. So that if you think back at that kind of a life, you can understand where that would come from. But when a child doesn't have his or her needs met at that time and has physical and emotional, so doesn't have the physical and emotional support, then he or she isn't going to grow up with that confidence or belief in themselves. And keeping in mind that the social and emotional responses of the primary caretaker, usually the parent, provides that infant with the information that they need from the world to help them later have healthy relationships. So we're going to look at attachment styles here. I want to run through this quickly because of the time that we have. So these are some different attachment styles that children develop as they're growing up. And as you can see, the anxious or anxious ambivalent is considered that insecure attachment. Individuals with this style will fear rejection, yearn for intimacy. They can be overly dependent and demanding sometimes in relationships. The fearful avoidant would be also considered an insecure attachment style. And this would be individuals the individual desires close relationships, but fears vulnerability. They may behave unpredictably due to that internal conflict that we just discussed. And they lack a consistent approach to intimacy. That avoidant or avoidant dismissive is also considered insecure attachment, and this is characterized by a strong sense of self-sufficiency, often to the point of appearing detached from others. These individuals do value their independence very highly and seem uninterested in close relationships. And so the last one is secure, which is secure attachment, obviously. And this person is comfortable with intimacy, can balance dependence and independence in a relationship. They're confident in their ability to meet the needs of others as well as their own needs, and have healthy, reasonable expectations that their own needs will also be met. So the root causes of people pleasing: poor self-esteem. People engage in people pleasing behavior because they don't value their own desires and needs. And due to that lack of self-confidence, they have a need for that external validation. So validation from the people around them. And if you do what other people want, then they're going to be happy with you, right? That insecurity, people might try to please others because they worry that other people won't like them if they don't go above and beyond to make others happy. Perfectionism, sometimes people want everything to be exact or to be just so, including how other people think and feel. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about past experiences. So painful, difficult, or traumatic experiences can also play a role in this, as we just discussed. So there are some emotions associated with people pleasing. For example, if we think back at JD, what are some of the emotions that JD might have been thinking about in the moment that he or she was being asked all those requests? So my guess would be that JD was probably pretty angry and frustrated, and somebody had said overwhelmed. Absolutely. Maybe there was some shame in there, resentment, like, why is everyone asking me for all of this? And then, of course, guilt. It's not uncommon, because you do want to say no. And if you say no, you're either going to feel guilty about saying no, or if you say no and it's not accepted, like people just ignore it, then you're going to feel guilt about that as well. And then, of course, there's always that anxiety and fear, that if I say no, I might disappoint people, I might disappoint my family, those types of things. So there's lots of emotions associated with it. We've already talked about some of this, but what are some of the consequences? We talked about feeling overwhelmed, self-neglect, because if you are pleasing others, you're not going to take care of yourself. We always talk about the airplane when the oxygen mask comes down, that you really want to, that you're really supposed to cover yourself up first, because if you don't put the oxygen mask on your own mouth, you could pass out and then you won't be able to help others. So, and that's kind of what happens if we just take care of others. Ultimately, we're going to end up passing out, right? Passive aggressive, because ultimately over time you become silently resentful and angry, especially if you feel taken advantage of. Emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, constant stress because of all the demands. Lack of authenticity is a big one, because you're certainly not going to be able to be yourself if you're always saying yes when you really want to say no. And then, of course, your relationships aren't going to be very strong because you're not being your authentic self in any relationship. So I just wanted to put this up. I always try to be everything to everyone and end up feeling burned out and exhausted, right? You're constantly going to feel exhausted, burned out, unable to meet the demands of others, and unable to take care of yourself at some level. So what are some tips to stop people pleasing? Okay, so it's very important that we establish healthy boundaries. So it is important to know your limits, to establish clear boundaries, and then communicate those limits. Be clear and specific about what you are willing to take on. So for example, setting boundaries about, and I'm just going to use this as a simple example, work calls at nighttime. I'm only going to take calls between this time, and then I'm going to shut it off. Or limit your availability. So if somebody asks you to do something, and just say, well, I can only do it this time and this day. I cannot do it all day, or I cannot do it for the next week. And being consistent is going to be really, really important here, because if you are a person that's always saying yes, when you initially start to say no, people are going to try to overstep those boundaries. And what you need to be able to do, what's important to be able to do, is to consistently say, I'm not able to do that. And saying no doesn't mean you have to give an explanation. Saying no is no. So it's okay to say, I'm just not able to do that right now. Or I wish I could fit that in, but I can't right now. I'd love to be able to help you in the future. Or I already have another obligation that day. Please consider me in the future. Those types of responses. So we do all have limits, and it's important that we recognize those. Challenging the thoughts is very important because questioning the belief and that our worth is dependent on others' approval is really going to be a big one. I would encourage people to seek therapy in those cases because it's very important that you go back and kind of explore where that comes from. Awareness is the number one step to change. So once you gain that awareness, then you can then take the steps you need to take to move forward and make changes. But validating yourself is going to be very important. Working on not basing your self-worth on others, but on how you feel about yourself. Because let's face it, people outside of us are unpredictable, and maybe they're in a bad mood that day, or maybe they had a fight with their spouse or something happened, and so nothing that we say or do is going to make them happy. So it's important that we recognize that our own inner traits and qualities are what make us special, not what other people think about us. I already talked about saying no, but realizing that you do have a choice is very important. When people ask you to do things, you may automatically say yes without realizing that, hey, there's a choice here. So you have a choice as to whether or not you say yes or no, and whether you can actually make it happen. And this may mean that sometimes we might want to stall for time while we assess the request. And it's okay to say, I need to check my schedule, or I'm going to need to really think about whether I can make that happen right now. So it is okay to say that. Setting our own goals and priorities is super important because that helps us determine whether the ask is possible for us. Understanding what we need to be focused on at that time. So ask yourself the question, what are the most important things to me? And use that to decide whether that is a task that you actually can do. Removing energy drainers and consider if you're being manipulated is a big one. So watch for those individuals who just suck the life out of you all the time. That's what I mean by energy drainers. They're constantly asking, or dumping, but there isn't the normal give and take in a healthy relationship. And it's not always easy to get rid of energy drainers. Sometimes they're family and sometimes they're coworkers. Those are the people we want to kind of distance from and make sure that we're setting those healthy boundaries consistently. But there are some people in our life that we make a choice to have them in our life. And if we really take stock of whether they're truly friends, give and take, or whether they're energy drainers, then we can determine if that's a person we really need or want to have in our lives. So assessing the relationships are important. Not Be very careful not to apologize if it's not your fault. I often tell people, if you're apologizing for something that's not your fault, you're actually making yourself look like it is your fault. So if something's not your fault, there's no need to apologize for it. And then, of course, realizing that you can't be everything to everyone. So you have to start small. You can only do so much. You do have to take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself, you cannot take care of others. So self-care is always important. Always make sure that you are able to take care of yourself and don't lose yourself in the process. Boundaries, again, we've talked about that. There are personal limits that we set. We really have to sit back and think about our boundaries. They protect our well-being, our values, our sense of self within a relationship. They define what we're comfortable with, and they help us maintain our identity and personal space. So there's 3 types of boundaries. There's rigid boundaries, porous boundaries, and healthy boundaries. And I'm sure that you can sit back and think about people that you know of that fall into these categories. So when we talk about rigid boundaries, this is someone who avoids intimacy and close relationships. They're unlikely to ask for help. They have few close relationships, and they're very protective of their personal information. So maybe you know some people you work with that fall into this category. They may seem detached, even with romantic partners, and they do keep others at a distance. And some people grow up in homes that have these very rigid boundaries as well. So they learn those boundaries in those homes. And then we could be quite the opposite of that, and that could be the porous boundaries. And these are people who tend to overshare personal information. These are people who don't often say no. They have difficulty with that. Over involved with other people's problems. I know there's certainly people I can think of in my life that are constantly telling me about their friends' problems or their kids' problems when their kids are adults. So they're very over involved. They're very dependent on others' opinions of themselves and opinions in general. They do accept, people with porous boundaries are often willing to accept abuse and disrespect. You want to be very careful about that. And they fear rejection. So on the other end is our healthy boundaries. These are people who do value their own opinion. They don't compromise their values for others. They share personal information in appropriate ways. They don't under or over. They know their own personal wants and needs and can communicate them, and they accept when others say no. So when someone says no to a person with healthy boundaries, they're okay with that. They don't get upset or angry with that at all. So we're going to talk about a little bit about self-care. It's very, very important, again, that you take care of yourself. We talked about that before. You have to nourish in order to flourish. Maintaining that healthy diet really involves eating at least one healthy meal a day. It doesn't mean that you have to eat healthy all day long. It just means get in your body those nutrients that you need. Making sure that you move on a daily basis, that you're not sitting in front of the computer all day long, that you get up and you stretch and you move and do those, as my colleague always says, movement snacks, where you get up and stretch and move around and release things. There is research out there that does indicate that people who tend to move on a regular basis while they're at work are more satisfied with their work and feel more productive. Getting plenty of sleep. I can't talk enough about how important sleep is to not only our emotional well-being, but our physical well-being and also our memory. Building that support system, again, a support system that's not full of people who drain our energy, but full of people who there's a give and take. And reaching out when we have that support system, because just having a support system isn't enough. We need to be able to reach out to them. Setting healthy boundaries, as we talked about, having personal time for yourself, at least 10 minutes a day. We talked about removing energy drainers and saying no. Being your own best friend. If you know how to be a best friend to others, you know how to be a best friend to yourself. Growing your own spirituality. And spirituality doesn't mean having to have an organized religion. It just means believing in something bigger than yourself. And it's okay. And having that community in that spirituality is really wonderful because it does help build that support system. Paying attention to our thoughts, as we talked about earlier, understanding if we do say no, that it's okay. And if someone isn't happy with us, that's okay as well. Practicing gratitude. Back to the thoughts, paying attention to catastrophizing and narrow thinking and black and white thinking, just being aware of whether we're being reasonable or unreasonable. Gratitude, I can't begin to tell you how much gratitude helps us in dealing with adversity in our lives. When we take stock of the things that we're grateful for, it really helps with that big, larger perspective of our lives. Learning meditation and relaxation. And then, of course, seeking help through your EAP and your online resource centers and your support groups that are out there. You don't have to be in crisis to reach out to talk to a therapist. You can talk to a therapist about anything, especially if you are trying to create more healthy boundaries in your own life. So I want to just end with a few quotes here. Don't be afraid of losing people. Be more afraid of losing yourself by trying to please everyone around you, because the reality of it is that we cannot please everyone. There are some people that cannot be pleased, And we're not capable of being able to please everyone. We would not know who we are. We would never be able to keep up with the demands of that. Be proud of who you are and not ashamed of how someone else sees you. So if you do say no, it is okay to do that. And it is okay if they're unhappy with you because you know who you are. So it's being proud of who you are. It is important to prioritize ourselves and to be kind. That doesn't mean that we're not going to do for others. It means that we're going to do for others in a balanced way instead of an imbalanced way. Although we have strengths, we are not here to do it all. We are here all for the first time. So it's never too late to make those healthy adjustments as we move forward in our lives. So challenge yourself by asking yourself these questions. Okay, do I care deeply about this task? When somebody asks you to do something, am I honoring someone or something I love by saying yes? Those are important. Am I feeling pressured to say yes because of fear of angering or upsetting someone? It's a big one. Are there others who can do this besides me? Does it have to be me? Do I have time to do this? Do I have an interest in doing this? Do I have the energy for it, which is a big one? And will I end up resenting myself or someone else if I take this on right now? So those are some of the questions you can ask yourself. All right, on that note, I am going to take any questions that may come out there. Tracy, if you could let me know.